Right. Okay, I think I'm online. Hi, everyone. Thanks for making it this morning. This is the third of a series of webinars that Acuity is doing to get under the skin of the various metrics that we use in benchmarking. This is the third, which is focusing on the TSMs. And yes, the ink is barely dry on this particular presentation. There's actually a lot to it. So without further ado, I'm going to try to share my screen. Right. So yeah, hopefully you can all see a presentation there. So the kind of content, what we're going to be doing is all shown here. Again, the entire purpose of today's session is about trying to ensure the quality of the data that you'll be submitting for the TSMs. It's focused on those who are tasked with collecting and submitting data. A bit of a caveat about today's presentation. These aren't Acuity metrics. They're not tried and tested. They're already generating, I think, a number of queries that the regulator's actually fielding. And there is an email address that you can use to question the regulator about some of the detail of the metrics. I actually think that most of the metrics are quite really well comprehensively defined. And they should, the definitions themselves should answer a lot of your queries. But as I say, there is an email address, which you'll see on one of the slides that you can get in touch with. It is necessarily complicated, this. It's some of the metrics just apply to your rental accommodation. Some apply to shared ownership. There's all different ways of slicing and dicing this. So there is a degree of complication involved. So I apologize for that. We're not going to go into the detail of every single TSM definition because it would just be too much. We'd be here all day and probably splitting it over a number of days. And as I say, to some extent, we haven't got the answers because they're not our metrics. And that's what the regulator's email is for. Survey methodology is also beyond the scope of the session. So the content I'm going to be covering is a quick tour of the regulatory requirements around the TSMs, how the TSMs relate and cut across some of the existing metrics that we already collect as part of benchmarking. Particularly some of the satisfaction metrics. If you were, reporting satisfaction metrics before, they were based on the STAR methodology, and basically the regulators' TSMs have snaffled a number of those and tweaked them. So I'll just be pointing out what's what there, and I'll also give you a little bit of a timeline. At various logical pauses, I will try to pick up any questions you might have as we go along. Please use the Q&A function on your toolbar there to provide me with a kind of a succinct question. And I'll, as I say, I'll do my best to answer it. Anything that I can't answer, I will follow it up. And as we're recording this, but also putting a copy of these slides on our website, I'll also do a little bit of a ready reckon of anything that I can't answer, and I'll provide the answers along with these materials. So I'll get cracking, but I can see I've already got a Q&A from somebody. Ah, right. Yes, Carrie. Yeah, well, hopefully I've just answered your question, which is how to get a copy of the slides. As I say, yeah, they'll all be available on the Acuity website. I think within the next week. But if you're desperate for them, if you just email me, I'll send you a copy of the slides straight away. Okay, without further ado, let's get cracking. As I say, a lot to cover. Oh yeah, this is scheduled to last 1.5 hours. I'll be frank with you, I have absolutely no bloody idea whatsoever how long this will take. As I say, the ink's just dry on it, and there's a lot of stuff here. So they're just not road tested. So again, apologies. Right, little bit of background to the TSMs. For those of you that are either kind of new to this, or you've just come into the sector quite new and don't know the full story, I'm going to whistle through this. In the wake of Grenfell, we had a social housing white paper that suggested ways of improving social housing management. And there was all kinds of stuff about social landlords pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, but it also included beefed up policing, if you like, of the sector through a beefed up regulator with beefed up consumer regulation. We did used to have quite chunky consumer regulation back in up to 2012, but the government of the time binned that. So we're kind of going back in time, if you like. And part of that, the first visible sign of consumer regulation is the inception of these TSMs. And the point about TSMs is they aim to make social landlord performance more transparent. And that transparency is basically the mother of accountability, if you like. You use the transparency to hold a social landlord to account. And it was felt that the principal people that needed to hold landlords to account, especially in the wake of Grenfell, and in the wake of what happened up in Rochdale, is that tenants need to hold that landlord to account. So having all that data out there is a way that tenants can do that. But also the regulator is going to be using them, as it does with the existing VFM metrics, to identify outliers for further scrutiny. And that further scrutiny could be desktop scrutiny that they do, or it could be via an inspection, such as an IDA, which is, most of you will never get an IDA because you're too small. Those below 1,000 stock don't get an IDA. But yeah, if you don't know what that is, it's just basically an in-depth assessment. All this transparency and accountability is meant to make boards and executives, the executive officers, feel a bit uncomfortable, feel a bit exposed. And through that exposure, it's hoped that it serves as a nudge or a pretty big shove for them to get a grip on the service. So the regulator consulted back in December 2021. There were a ton of responses, and they were mainly the regulator chewed over the bones of that consultation, and last September came out with a decision statement. And as you can see, this slide includes tons of hypertext links that will take you to the absolute killer documents that you need to acquaint yourself with. This presentation can only get you so far. Talking to consultants can only get you too far. This is a pretty big deal. It is a regulatory requirement. And so on the back of the decision statement, there were at least 3 really important documents that you need to be across. You need to make them your friends. It will require a degree of effort. So the first one is there's a new standard. So this will be the first of the consumer standards, and it's a new standard that is specifically focused squarely on these TSMs. It tells you very, very briefly about what the expectations are, and I'll go into that shortly. It also introduced 22 TSMs, but because a number of those TSMs are actually split into 2, it's actually 26 metrics in total. And accompanying those metrics are really detailed definitions that I think broadly are pretty good. And you really need to be across Annex 4 because they tell you how to calculate these metrics. And it is a regulatory requirement that you calculate them just so. 12 of those 22 metrics are perception satisfaction metrics, and 10 of them are just come from your management info. So, as I say, 4 of those metrics are split into 2. There are 2 complaints metrics, which are both split by stage 1 and stage 2 complaints. So that's about you staying, working, your overall proportion of complaints to the stock that you've got, but also how you're responding to the Ombudsman's timelines. So basically those 2 complaints, each split into stage 1 and 2, and that actually gives you 4 metrics there on those complaints. ASB is 2. You've got the ASB cases that you're tackling relative to your stock size, and there's one figure which is total ASB, and there's a sub-metric of that, which is of those, what's the proportion of hate ASB. There's a repairs targets, that's the percentage of your repairs where you're hitting your own targets, and they are split into emergencies and non-emergencies. The third document that you need to get your head across is Annex 5, which gives you chapter and verse on how you get those 12 perception metrics. The TSMs go live next week, and they are in respect of the financial year 23 to 24, with a year running from the 1st of April to the 31st of March. So you will be collecting your data on this first year of the TSMs, in the weeks, months following the 31st of March next year. Those of you that want to pilot these metrics, or you want a baseline figure before you do it for real at the end of March next year, you can actually submit your results for these metrics in the next 6-7 weeks as part of your normal data collection with Acuity, and we'll knock up a pilot report for those that want it. What I should say, and those of you that have suffered my previous 2 workshops on metrics will know that benchmarking definitions don't legislate for every single peculiarity that you might face. As I say, I do think these are pretty good definitions, but there'll always be providers that have specific situation that the definition may be silent on. So I would say, as with the inception of anything that the regulator introduces, to some extent, year 1 is about sucking it and seeing and ironing out a few issues. And as I've already kind of said, any issues that you struggle with, as you've poured over these definitions in Annex 4, if you're still scratching your head, just use that email address there, which is straight to the regulator, and they'll endeavour to give you an answer. But I think over the next year, I think the TSMs are going to feature in our club discussions. So I actually think, between Acuity and us all getting our heads together around meetings, I think we'll be able to start working our way through these things. So there's a bit of background for you. Here's the metrics. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. So as I say, the first 12 metrics are satisfaction metrics, with a number of them overlapping existing metrics that you already collect and you will be familiar with. I will show you a bit further on a set of slides exactly where they overlap and how we've rebadged existing satisfaction metrics. But perhaps but a few of the metrics down in the second half of this table, how we've rebadged them now as TSMs, because the last thing you want is metrics in the system that do the same thing or nearly the same thing, and then you end up filling out the wrong metric. So we've had to do a whole bunch of rationalization behind the scenes at Acuity. So as I say, these are all your satisfaction metrics, and down here are your those TSMs that are generated from management information. Again, virtually all of them are expressed as percentages. So for instance, with gas safety checks, it's the percentage of gas safety checks that you've nailed, expressed, compared to the overall amount of properties that you need to do a gas safety check on. It's that kind of thing. So the only exception to metrics being expressed as a percentage is these two. And I say two, but as I pointed out, these metrics, anything that I've kind of shaded in blue, are actually split into two, as I previously mentioned. So the first of the complaints metrics, which is complaints relative to the size of the landlord, the way that's expressed is per 1,000 homes. So that's how you get the complaints relative to the size of the landlord. It's complaints received per 1,000 homes. And similarly, ASB is expressed as ASB cases relative to the size of the landlord. Very, very briefly, the main changes between consultation and the actual finalized metrics, just to prove that they did listen to some extent to people feeding back through the consultation process. There were very few major changes. That's the main thing to clock. One TSM was completely deleted, and that was a TSM that basically wanted to look at tenant knowledge of how to make a complaint. Now, clearly, that was deleted from the suite because it's a fairly gormless thing to ask. There was one TSM in the consultation that, as a result of the consultation, has actually become two metrics. And in the consultation, it was billed as the extent to people, that are satisfied that they live in a safe and well-maintained home. Now it's split out as two metrics, and that is satisfaction that the home is safe, and that actually includes common areas now. And then there's another metric that says satisfaction that the home is well-maintained. And of course, those two things were split out because safe and well-maintained are two completely different things. It could be a really well-maintained home, but it's not that safe. And so it's kind of unhelpful to lump those two things together. So two metrics there. And then kind of related to that, to the common areas bit in that metric about being that the home is safe, is that they narrowed the focus of another metric, which was satisfaction that the landlords keeps communal areas clean, safe, and well maintained. So what they've done is they've taken safe out of that, again, because that metric was trying to do too many things at once by covering three different things. They've whipped safe out of that and bundled it into the metric above. So they're the main changes. There were some minor changes, and there's quite a few minor changes, but we're talking about tiny tweaks and clarifications in the detail of both the metrics definitions, but also the survey method. And if you're really interested to see what changed, you need to go to the actual decision statement document and see page 3. The other thing is it's not over yet, the TSMs. We might get another 2 metrics at some point in the future when the government completes work that the department's doing on electrical safety and communal standards, the standard of maintenance of communal areas, because that was something that tenants during their consultation for the white paper were very keen about there being standards set for communal areas. So watch this space. I'm just going to see if there's any questions. There's no questions so far. I hope this is going all right so far. As I say, any questions now, because we're getting into more detail, do use the Q&A function on your toolbar. So, as I said, we've got a brand new standard that's actually operational as from next week. It's a standard completely dedicated to these metrics, frankly. And what that standard says is a bunch of commandments. So if you're a registered provider, and I'm guessing you all know whether you are or not, you must collect and provide information to support scrutiny by tenants. And by information, we are obviously, in this context, we're talking about these things. And the information that must accompany the TSMs when reported. So, as I've already said, it is your job to adhere to the definitions and the survey method set out in detail in those 2 annexes. All of you, it doesn't matter how small you are, you might only have 50 stock. If you're a registered provider, you have to collect these metrics, you have to be mindful of those annexes, and you have to publish your performance to your tenants. And alongside you publishing how you've performed on these metrics, you have to provide some kind of assurance statement of the steps that you've taken to, if you like, comply with Annex 4 and 5. And when you, in terms of reporting your results, it must be timely, but it doesn't say when. So obviously, that's for you to make a judgment. So in your reporting of this, it has to be timely, it has to be clear, and it must be easily accessible to your tenants. And that's all about you making a judgment on those issues. Now, I don't know when timely is. I can tell you when the regulator issues its global accounts, and that's generally in November. It provides data. And I know from past experience when organizations have reported to their tenants, quite often they report at some point in the autumn. You will already have a timetable for reporting to your tenants. So I would suggest, as long as you're not reporting to them a year after the fact, I think if you're reporting at some point in the autumn, just going into early winter, I think that seems about right to me. But it's not, again, we'll have to see if the regulator pulls anybody up for it not being timely. But I would have thought somewhere, you need to be aiming for the first frosts to the first flurries of snow. All registered providers must ensure that the info that they're publishing is accurate, reliable, valid, and transparent. And the board is ultimately responsible for that. So the board will need some assurance from its executive that you are across this standard, Annex 4 and 5, and that you're completely regulatory compliant on this. If you have more than 1,000 stock, and most of you listening probably haven't got more than 1,000 stock, you also have to submit this TSM data to the regulator so it can use it for regulation. And by 1,000 of relevant stock, I mean where your low-cost rental accommodation and your low-cost home ownership accommodation is 1,000 plus. So it's combining those two figures. So you're kind of what I'm calling your social housing rented accommodation plus your shared ownership is 1,000 plus. And I'm going to come to the definition of relevant stock in a second. If you have less than 1,000 relevant stock, you don't have to publish this data to the regulator at all. There's absolutely no requirement. But of course, you still need to publish it to your tenants because the whole point of this primarily isn't about the regulator, about being transparent to your tenants. So, as always, Acuity benchmarking, not the surveying side, but the benchmarking side looks after those with less than 1,000 stock. So we're going to be collecting this data for you to basically help you get the data right and help you report it to your tenants. Right, I'm just going to pause now and have a quick butcher's some of the questions. Right, Steve Warren, you're up first. The questions around common areas are very subjective and may mean different things to different tenants. How much flexibility do we have to define what a communal area is to avoid confusion? Well, the quick answer to that, Steve, what I will say is at our annual conference in April, we're going to have a session completely dedicated to nailing the survey side of this and survey practice. So Denise Rain's going to take us blow by blow through that. And of course, we provide surveying services as well. So we can help you nail this kind of thing. But what I will say is that both Annex 4 and Annex 5, that's the how you calculate the metric, but also the survey methodology, goes into great detail about exactly how you should phrase this question and what you can and cannot say to help the tenant actually answer the question correctly. And this is one of the metrics / survey questions where you get to ask a filter question first, like, basically, do you live in accommodation that is served by these by communal areas? But anyway, I would, in the first instance, refer you to the chapter and verse in the actual guidance. Paul Tewksbury, is there a common calculation to calculate metrics per 1,000 if you only have 168? That's a great question. Off the top of my head, can't do it now. But I think that's the kind of thing that we can come up with to help you answer that. And what we'll do is we'll stick that on the materials. The 1,000 product. We'll stick that to give you an idea about how you should do that. It's a really good question. And Taylor, we issue our VFM in both our annual accounts and our annual report, so we'll probably do it then. The annual report is issued by 30th of September. Yeah, thanks, Anne. I did need my memory jogging on that because it's been ages since I've looked at the kind of publications that people pumped out to their tenants. But I always had it in my head that you kind of did it round about autumn and whatever. So I very, very much, I think that kind of timescale is great. If you are reporting to your tenants generally in round about September, just going into autumn, that would be ideal for this. And I'm pretty sure that would be regarded by the regulator as timely. Marcia Cunnason, we've piloted the TSM question, she says. What we found is that tenants that have been dissatisfied for an ASB case have marked us negatively for both ASB handling and complaint handling, as they use the terms interchangeably. What can we do to ensure we don't get marked down twice for the same thing? Right, I'm not sure there's much that you can do for this. I think there's a number of these metrics, and typically it's ASB and complaints. When you're asking people about the extent to which they're satisfied with the way that you've handled things, basically the way the complaint or the ASB panned out, whether it was your fault or not, it is factored in to that result. During the consultation phase, when the regulator was asking questions about this, certainly Acuity and a host of individual organizations made this point that actually there's a certain amount of this over which we've not got control. But nevertheless, the regulator felt it was worth proceeding with it. In fairness, the regulator really understands this issue as well and will interpret it, will take it into consideration when looking at it. I don't think there's any neat way around this, because that will always be a factor. I would say whenever you discuss these results, or whenever you're printing something where you're the contextual information that you set out that accompanies such results, is that I think it's completely fair for you to caveat certain metrics and explain the limitations of those metrics or the vagaries of those metrics, and how other factors beyond your control can often influence a metric. So those of you that have known me over the years, I'll always say that metrics just looked at in isolation are potentially dangerous. They need to sit as part of a story, part of a narrative that provides some context to those metrics, but also explains the difficulties or problematic nature of some metrics. That's okay. Frankly, there's no easy answer to that one. Right, I'm going to crack on. So that's the TSM standard. In terms of the TSMs themselves, as I say, I'm not going to go into full definitions of each of the metrics because that would just be awful. I'm going to go into the general things that you need to clock about all the TSMs. As I said, I'll keep saying it, Annex 4, you will get chapter and verse there. So I mentioned before that you should only be collecting data for relevant homes. And by relevant homes, the regulator is interested in low cost. And we're only talking about social housing here, right? This is the regulator of social housing demanding information from you. And they're only asking for information about social housing. So when we're talking about relevant homes, we're talking about social housing, and we're talking about rental social housing. And that basically includes general needs. You're all familiar with that. Supported, of which obviously housing for older people is a subset. We're also talking about any intermediate rents and temporary social housing. Now, very few, if any, will have intermediate rents. Some of you, particularly supported guys, will have some temporary social housing. The point is they're all captured as far as the data is concerned here. So the other thing to clock, and I'm going to zip down to this bullet here before I tackle these sub-bullets. So you're collecting all this rental social housing, rental accommodation that we know and love. But we're also picking up low-cost home ownership. accommodation. And this is mainly shared ownership homes. That is the main type. The point here to clock is if you want chapter and verse on how do you define low-cost rental accommodation? How do you define low-cost home ownership? You just need to go to the Housing and Regeneration Act, and it's quite specific about what those forms of housing are. And I've given you hypertext links straight to those sections of the statute. Suffice to say, for low-cost home ownership, it is pretty much shared ownership. There are a few obscure other shared ownership type products or shared equity type products that you might want to give it a glance, but I'm not going to get bogged down in it now. So if I can just go back to low-cost social renting, the general needs supported housing and housing for older people, traditionally, that's, they're the main forms of social housing that Acuity and Housemark have always benchmarked. So you'll be super familiar with those. And you'll know that we typically divvy up certain metrics into these groupings to give you better comparisons so that you can compare general needs with general needs, that kind of thing. And that's particularly the case for satisfaction, because we know these different client groups will report satisfaction in different ways. So the point you need to know about this is the regulator doesn't want that divvied out into, frankly, useful client groups. It wants an aggregated low-cost rental figure. So that's what we're giving you on your data sheets. You will see a prefix on the appropriate TSM metrics that will say this, so that you know that you're providing the aggregated figure for regulatory purposes. However, we also know that you really like collecting metrics divided like GN, HFOP, and support, because they're far more useful, because you get more meaningful comparisons, as I've said. So where appropriate, the 12 tenant perception metrics, we will make available sub-metrics of the catch-all metric, the consolidating metric. We will make these sub-metrics available to you in keeping with our current practice. So yeah, so on your data entry sheet, you'll actually be presented with an appropriate GN, HFOP, or support variant, depending on current practice. So you won't be given all three of these and be made to make a decision. If you as a club or you as an organization are already just mainly collecting the GN version of this, that's the only one that you'll see. And so that's just to avoid any further confusion. So you'll be given the subvariant, you'll be given the aggregate metric to ensure regulatory compliance. And for good measure, you're going to be given the low-cost home ownership metric as well. And I'm going to come to this again, because you may never need to use this metric, but some of you might, this variant of it, because some of you might want to do it. But in a couple of slides, I'm going to show you why for smaller organizations, you don't need to necessarily collect low-cost home ownership as a separate metric at all. You might just bin it because it's just going to be too much trouble. I'm going to come to that in a second. So hopefully you've got that. You can kind of see that they want a consolidated metric here, but for just those 12 tenant perception metrics, we are going to give you subvariants as well, because we think that's going to be a more meaningful tool for your benchmarking. We will give you this to make sure that the consolidated one, to make sure that you're compliant. So I hope that's pretty clear. I'm just going to press on before I kind of snaffle some more questions. So a few more general requirements. It's the owner/landlord that reports on the TSM, not the managing agent. Because take you back to the white paper, this is all about making the owner/landlord accountable. The buck stops with them, not a managing agent that they've chosen to deploy. So all the TSMs are based on ownership. And here's the thing you need to clock about the distinction between having a leasehold interest and leaseholders, right? So for the purposes of the TSMs, if you are leasing a dwelling from somebody else, it doesn't matter if they're another social landlord or they're part of the private rented sector. If you are leasing that dwelling from them, for you to run your business, to meet your social purpose, if you like, you're assuming the role of the owner/landlord there, right? If you're leasing accommodation from a third party for you to run your social landlord services, that actually that's classed as you owning it, right? So you have to report on that unit. On the other hand, if you've got any leaseholders where people have executed their right to buy back in the day, or they've done their right to acquire, or whatever, if they're a leaseholder where they've purchased a leasehold interest, right, they are not included. So leaseholders and any non-social accommodation that you've got are simply not included, and that's because they're not social housing, and this is all about social housing. So those properties where you've taken on a lease to do your business, that is social housing, so that gets counted. So in terms of how do you count your units, well, they're based on dwelling units. They also use the term homes. They use the term homes because they think as well, they are interchangeable, but in some of their publications, they're going to be using the term homes because that's more tenant friendly. So you count all self-contained units, but if you're, if you've got hostels and stuff like that, you're counting bed spaces too in non-self-contained housing. And this probably doesn't apply to very many of you, but the idea is when you report these figures, if you've got a bunch of subsidiaries that all own social housing, you should be consolidating those figures across the subsidiaries and providing a group figure. But if not, it's just individual organizations are reporting on their specific housing association, simple as that. Right, I'm just going to pick up a couple of questions. Belinda Eastland saying, in the first year, if we report in the autumn, do we use our 6 months data from new surveys from April 2023 and the last 6 months from 2022? Right. Again, I'm not getting too involved, Belinda, in the survey methodology here, but again, what I'd say is Annex 5 has chapter and verse on how you should be conducting a survey. The surveys have to be done as a single event, but they can be staged from memory. But, again, we're going to, Denise Rain at our annual conference is going to really get stuck into the detail of this. What I can tell you is that everybody has to report on those satisfaction metrics in the first year of reporting. So that means that the clock's ticking now as we go through this year. And so I'd be surprised if many of you have actually got a TSM compliance survey done in the last few months since the decision statement came out. But the point is you'll have to report in relation to this first year. But for smaller associations, as I said, those with less than 1,000 stock, you only need to survey every 2 years. So the data, can be more than within that calendar year. But again, I don't know, that might answer your question. If I partly dodged it by just saying, check the guidance on this, or come along to the session that we're going to have at our conference, I do apologize for that. Joe Langfield, to clarify, for reporting purposes to the regulator on the TSMs, shared ownership properties are not reported on. Joe, I'm going to come to this in a moment, as because I think it's on the next slide or the slide after, because again, this is another one of those complications. There are a number of metrics, mainly the perception, the 12 perception metrics, where you will see that the basic regulatory requirement is that you report separately for low-cost rental accommodation and low-cost home ownership. But if you're less than 1,000 stock, they give you a get out of jail free card on this. So that's the perception metrics. I'm kind of preempting what I'm saying, but it's kind of worth repeating this as well, because it is one of those awful complicated bits that you have to get your head around. It probably just helps me talking through it now. But for the remaining metrics, you'll see that some of the metrics, actually you will have to capture at least some home ownership if you've got them, because the regulatory requirement is that you're combining your rental and your home ownership. So you can't completely dodge the home ownership thing. You can dodge it on the satisfaction metrics, and you'll see exactly what I mean in a few minutes. Anne Taylor again, we will have to check bed spaces, maybe with the regulator, about our care home, because this is defined as legacy social housing under the H&R Act 2008, because it was built with some grant. That's a good point. And again, as I've already said, the guidance / definitions don't legislate for absolutely everything. So there will be some things that you'll have to refer to the regulator. The other thing that I will say is somewhere in the documentation, they do, in terms of counting social housing, they do make reference to legacy social housing and its exclusion. So again, if you check out the Annex 4 on that, you'll see what I mean by that. Oh lordy, Jill Peckham. Our first TSM compliant. Oh, you've already done one. Our first TSM compliance survey will take place this year. Oh, okay. So the 2022 data for submission post 31 of March is based on non-compliant. Therefore, I'm presuming that the benchmarking data entry sheet on the website will also allow for KPI submission that is pre-TSM. Absolutely, Jill. So here's the thing. We have created these metrics for you so that those of you that want to pilot / baseline, yes, you can. But if you're not in position to do that and you want to report as per the existing arrangements, yeah, that's fine too. Oh, that's what I'm trying to multitask here badly. Right, I'm up to date on that. Right, I'll crack on. Yeah, I hope this is okay for you and it's not too much. I'm going to lie down afterwards. So yes, right. So this is the really complicated bit that I was referring to. about the treatment when low-cost home ownership is in or out. So I think we all need to take a deep breath here. So the regulator requires different treatment for different groups of TSMs. For instance, with ASB and the health and safety TSMs, by health and safety TSMs, I, of course, mean the gas, electrical, lifts, water, that kind of stuff, all those checks. They want a low-cost rental, so your social rents and your home ownership as a combined figure. So I forget who asked the question, but so this is my point about you not being able to completely dodge reporting on home ownership, because there's no variance to this. There's no, we want you to report low-cost rental and low-cost home ownership separately. It is a combined figure. It's just the one metric. That's it, done and dusted. So that captures any home ownership that you've got. And I think the reason for that, by the way, is because they imagine that those activities, such as health and safety and ASB, would affect any shared owners and renters in a similar way. So that's why they're bundling it all together. Satisfaction with repairs, the satisfaction time taken for repairs, satisfaction that your home is well maintained, the extent to which you're meeting the decent homes requirements, and the extent to which you're meeting your own repairs target times, you report those just for your rental accommodation only. And again, the rationale behind that is, of course, you don't do those things for shared owners. So that's why you're collecting it just for your rental ones. The really complicated bit, as always, is the perception metrics, but I'm going to bundle two of the complaint metrics in there as well. And the bog standard requirement here is to report those separately, right? But before you start asking questions about this, I'm going to explain. The reason that they're separate is because traditionally we all know and love these indicators, and we've all marveled at how anybody, that shared owners are they will generally mark you down quite a bit compared to renters. So by separating them out, there's the regulator is kind of acknowledging that there's a difference in experience between the two client groups, and it wants to see transparently how each of those sit. But my point is that's the general requirement, and here's the get out of jail free card for smaller ones on these perception metrics. If you've got less than, and this isn't a combined figure. Before I was talking about combined figures where if you've got less than 1,000 stock, which is your rental accommodation and home ownership accommodation combined, that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm saying if you have less than 1,000 rental units and you have 1,000 you've got less than 1,000 home ownership units, you can basically report these tenant perception metrics in any combination you want. You could just report it for your rental units. You could just report it for your home ownership units. God knows why you do that. You can report them both separately. Or you can do a combined figure. And as for the two complaint metrics, you can do the same thing. But there's a tiny little caveat with this. If you are not reporting them separately for rental and for home ownership, you have to justify it. And I think probably if you're a small organization, you'd probably justify it on the basis that you've got so few accommodation of so few home ownership, it's not worth you doing, sort of thing. So what I would say is, if you are considering combining your rental with your home ownership for perception metrics, it's likely that any home ownership will disproportionately damage your score, because, as I've said, they're generally more miserable than your average rental tenant. So, as I say, I'm just musing about this. It does beg the question of why you would bother reporting LCHO at all, given its potential skewing effect due to its low numbers, but also the extra faff of collecting it. Now, you might be a transparency purist, so you might want to do it, and fair play. Okay, go for it, or you might have sufficient low-cost home ownership where you think actually it is worth us doing, and we're committed to doing this. All I'd say in that case, if you are reporting it, if you are combining it with your rental, is again, in the contextual information that surrounds your reporting of this, you explain the weird and wonderful way in which a home ownership figure could skew things. So my point is, on the system, on the data entry system, you will see for these 12 metrics, an LCHO prefix on the metrics for those of you that actually want to measure it separately. I hope that's all right. I found that difficult. I don't know how you found it. Right. So a few more TSM requirements. If you've got less than 1,000 of those relevant stock, which we know is the aggregate of your rental and home ownership, you actually don't have to collect and report on an April to March basis if you've already got a different financial year. Now, most of you will have a, quote, normal financial year that goes from April to March. So obviously, none of this is an issue. But those of you got the wacky financial year that kind of ends in September or December, you can do all of this on that basis. Simple as that. If you've got more than 1,000 of that stock combined, you have to run the perception survey every year. You've got less, as I've already said, it's up to you. You might want to run it every year, and I suppose that's good practice, but you really don't have to. It's okay to have 2-year-old data. And as I've already said, so whilst smaller organizations only have to do the survey every 2 years, they are expecting you to report on it in this first year. So if you haven't thought about getting a survey done and dusted kind of between now and kind of next March, you need to be thinking about it. As I said, I don't want to get into surveys at all, but I just thought I'd stick this in. There's quite a bit of flexibility there to run the survey by post, phone, by any means necessary or whatever that is best suited to your punters. When you're reporting the results, you do have to say, though, which method you use, because as we all know, so whilst the regulator is giving you flexibility how you carry out that methodology, everybody knows that the way that you carry it out can influence the results. So you are expected in the narrative that accompanies you reporting this, that you explain the method that you use to get the survey results and how many responses you got, and whether you used some form of weighting. So I don't want to spoil Denise's session next month at our annual conference. She will really be getting stuck into this and really, I don't know, giving you the basis to kind of really master the survey side of things. Right, I'm just going to pick up a quick question. It's Joe Langfield. We've got 1,394 properties in total, of which 48 are LCHO. I presume this means we will have to report LCHO separately. How will complaint metrics be affected by the LCHO properties if we have to report on complaints per 1,000 properties? Right. Right. If I can handle the second part of that first, as per the previous question, where they only had 168 properties and it had to be reported on 1,000, I'm just not mentally dexterous enough to come up with some kind of clever formula that deals with that. I think it's fairly simple to crack that. And it probably involves decimal places, I am thinking. I will come up with an answer and I will post it with the materials used for this session. So sorry to dodge that. I might have to dodge the next bit. So the point is, I think the actual regulator's guidance on this isn't entirely clear about the extent to which you have to report, your 48 LCHO properties separately. I think I will put it on my list to ask the regulator. If you want a really quick answer on it, I think you can ask the regulator on that, because I have pored over the guidance a number of occasions, and it's not entirely clear that the different variations that they've set out gives a clear answer to your specific situation, because you could read it one way, which is that you don't have to report those LCHOs separately. Or you could read it another way, which means that you're caught and you do. So along with the other one, I will pursue that with the regulator, because obviously some of these things have just never come up before. So it's more than 1,000 low cost, but less than 1,000 home ownership. I'll ask the regulator and I'll try and come back with an answer. Joe, if it's not working in your time scale, or you don't see something materializing within the next week, just drop me an email and I'll try and sort that one out for you. Right, I'm going to try and crack on. So what I've done there, without us getting into the major definitions, the detail of the definitions, is kind of provide you with the, if you like, the basic regulatory rules that sit around the metrics. What I'm hoping the slides do, because obviously there's a lot of material on the slides, is when you go back to the slides and perhaps even go back to this recording, you will see, hopefully it will be a really useful prompt for you to see the basic architecture and thinking behind how they want data reported. So what I'm doing here is showing you how Acuity data collection and what the clubs do reflects the inception of the TSMs here. So on each of these next 4 slides, I'm setting out each of the TSMs. Here's their TSM code number. This is the kind of short title that they provide for each of the metrics. So hopefully that's self-explanatory. This tells you to what extent, whether this metric needs to be reported for rental and LCHO separately, or whether it's, in the case of the second metric, because it's a repairs metric, you only have to collect it for rental, or if it's combined. And you'll see that a number of the metrics, as we go through this list, will be combined. So that horribly painful slide where I say they slice and dice the metrics differently, this is your at-a-glance guide to how that works. But as I've already said, if you're a smaller provider, the point is with all of these first 12 metrics, so that's this slide and the next metric, it really is up to you whether you bother with this LCHO at all. And going back to the previous slide, any of these metrics in the first two slides, which are all your satisfaction metrics, in accordance with current satisfaction practice, we have given you, if you like, sub-indicators for general needs HFO support to make more meaningful comparisons within your clubs. But for regulatory purposes, as I say, we give you this aggregate as well. So there you go. What have we done? So with the regulators, sorry, and then in the next column, I've flagged where it's similar to an existing metric that you already collect. You know, a lot of these with that prefix there, STA, means they come from the STAR survey. So I've flagged where they are similar or pretty much the same. And then in this final column, at a glance, I've said what our treatment is. So for instance, overall satisfaction is pretty much the same as the existing overall satisfaction. And so we've simply rebadged our existing metric STA1. We've simply rebadged it to the regulator's TPO1. As far as satisfaction with repairs is concerned, again, both of these metrics are pretty much collected by most clubs. The regulator actually wanted the perception as opposed to the transactional metric, because all of the regulators' TSMs that are based on satisfaction surveys are perception-based. They ditch the idea of transactional. So our existing perception indicator, STA6, has basically been rebadged with the regulator's TPO2. We have retained this metric, which is the identical metric, but it's transactional. We've retained it in the system, notwithstanding a little bit of a potential for confusion, because many of you like to collect it as a transactional indicator. The next few metrics are probably uncontentious because they are just completely new metrics. So that's time taken to complete the most recent repair and the well-maintained metric. The regulator's satisfaction that the home is safe is very similar to an existing metric, ST8. And so we have rebadged it, TP05. Similarly, TP06 is very similar to the listens and acts metric that we've had for some years that we all loathe, but that's been rebadged. Keeping tenants informed, the last one on that page, is a brand new metric. So it's non-contentious. It just sits in the new suite as a brand new metric. We carry on with the satisfaction-based metrics. And you'll see we've got another brand new metric in the shape of TP08, which is the landlord treating tenants fairly and with respect. In terms of the regulator's satisfaction with the landlord approach to handling complaints, that is quite similar to an existing metric that's collected by a couple of clubs. So we have simply rebadged SP06 to the regulator's TP09. So, as I said, all of these metrics in the satisfaction suite, we've provided you with the general needs, HFOP and support split for more meaningful comparisons. So whilst we provide that for you, I'd simply question whether you want to split this particular one. It's totally up to you. It's there if you want to split it, because of the low caseload is likely to be quite skewing. The point is obviously you don't have to ever report this to anybody as a split indicator, but you might find it useful in terms of your own management of the service and to understand how the different client groups feel about the complaint side of things. So that's all I'm doing by saying, you might want to think about whether this is a kind of metric that you do want to split, even though you can. So the next one is all about communal areas, and it's quite similar to an existing metric that's only collected by one club. So we have rebadged that. And again, I'm saying the same thing as above, in that you could split this out by client group if you wanted to, but bearing in mind that not all of your dwellings have communal areas, and therefore we're talking about perhaps quite a small subset of your tenants, therefore it's a low caseload. Do you want to necessarily split this out? It's up to you. Making the regulator's metric about the extent to which you make a positive contribution to neighbourhoods is completely new, uncontentious. It's in there as a new metric. Satisfaction that the landlord's approach to handling ASB is quite similar to an existing metric that's collected just by one of the clubs. It cuts completely across it. So what we've done is we've killed off that old metric and simply adopted it. I'm going to soldier on through. So we're now into the management info. We're out of the satisfaction metrics now. And the key point that I want to make here is splitting metrics out by us giving you GN, HFOP, and support metrics split out to just facilitate your own benchmarking, in addition to the regulatory requirement, the combined LCRA, only really applies to those last 12 metrics because it fits with the whole satisfaction thing. Now, traditionally with repairs type metrics, we have never split them by general needs, HFOP, etc., because it's about your property. Your property is your property, blah, blah, blah. So we're not proposing splitting these out at all. I'd also say, as far as complaints and ASB is concerned, because these are, because you'll have a lower caseload potentially, just as I said on the previous slide, you may not want to, well, it'd be unhelpful for you to divvy these out, and they're not satisfaction metrics anyway. It would be really unhelpful to split them down any further. So there aren't the options, is basically what I'm saying, to split them down further here. They are just as you see them. So the complaints relative to the size of the landlord cut across a number of existing metrics collected, particularly by a couple of clubs. The potential for confusion is significant. We're killing those metrics off. So in the system, you'll just find the brand new metrics for this. Similarly, complaints responded to within the Ombudsman's timescales, they cut across further metrics, which potential for confusion, significant. We've killed them off. We've just adopted the regulator's new metrics because they do pretty much the same thing. ASB is all about caseload. As I said in previous slides, brand new metrics. We just take them on as new metrics. Homes not meeting the decent home standard. Well, back in the day, you probably collected decent homes metric. None of the clubs collect it now, but it's still lurking in the system. But because the wording slightly changed and there's capacity for confusion, we've simply rebadged it. And the repairs completed within target timescales. Now, most of you clubs collect these. Most of you will know that I'm not particularly keen on these because I just think they're so dated, but I know your boards like them. And it's the fact that you can set different target timescales, I think offends my benchmarking sensibilities, but the regulator's gone for it. Regulator trumps me. So the point is the regulators completed within target timescales, which is basically splits your responsive repairs into emergencies and non-emergencies. It completely cuts across 4 metrics that we already report to you. So what we've basically done with the emergency metric, we've simply rebadged the emergency response times to the existing, we've rebadged our existing metric to the regulator's metric because the non-emergencies cuts across the way that we used to split things between urgent and routine. We've just deleted the existing urgent and routine metrics and replaced it with the new regulator's metric, which basically combines urgent and routine. And again, all this is to maintain our own sanity. So I hope you get what we've done there. So now for repairs completed within target timescales, we haven't got the 3 or 4 that you will always collect. We've just got the 2 regularly. Right. So the last slide is these are all about health and safety. So what happened here is the gas safety checks, the regulator's gas safety checks, cuts across one of our gas ones, and that's the more onerous ones. That's the one where it captures, back in the day when people first started collecting gas safety metrics, everybody would kind of say, oh, bloody hell, 80%, we only got certificates covering 80% of our homes. So in March, we're going to send every man and his dog out to do the inspection. So on the 31st of March, we've got a valid certificate. Well, that metric looks very, very tired. And we replaced it at a number of clubs with the more onerous percentage of gas safety checks completed within target. And that stopped you going bonkers in March to get loads of certificates, because if any of your dwellings were without a certificate within a 12-month period, you'd have to count them in this metric. And funnily enough, That's exactly the kind of thing that the regulator went for. So we have rebadged our more onerous gas metric to the regulators, and we've killed off the sad and sickly gas metric. The rest of your checks are all new metrics. And let me just see what I've got here. Yeah, and as I said, there's absolutely no need for to split these down by you. So I hope that's reasonably clear. It's hopefully these 4 slides serve as a quick at a glance guide of where you are in terms of reconciling new metrics, the regulators' metrics with what we're already doing. So let's have a quick look at some of your questions. Anne, will it be we have 168 properties as oh, you're not going to make me do mental maths live. I only got a B. As a proportion of 1,000 properties, this is if we have 2 complaints, 2 multiplied by. Wow. Well, yes, I'm not going to try and do that, air that calculation for everybody and try and work it out. I think, Anne, you're going along the right lines. That, as I said before, I think it involves lots of decimal places. I can see that you've got millions of. I think you're right. Christopher is saying, is there a clear definition of what is ASB and what might be a neighbour dispute? For example, who gets to use a washing line in a communal area? That sounds like when I was a housing officer. That's the kind of stuff I'd have to weigh in on. It might not be defined as ASB, but can escalate to ASB if it disputes. Yes, there is a clear definition. And again, I would commend you to the actual appendices. The regulator's gone to some effort to be absolutely clear about what constitutes antisocial behaviour and when you should start counting a case. So yes, it is definitely there. I can't give you chapter and verse at the moment without it taking some time. Jill, will detailed guidance notes on each metric, especially the new revised metrics, be provided as very helpfully they are now on the data entry portal against each one? Yes, Jill, what I should say is, whilst I'm saying it's a solemn duty for you to be across the regulators' documents, particularly annexes 3, 4, and 5, we have lifted the definitions verbatim from Annex 4 and put them in our system, so that when any of you are entering data for any of the TSMs, if you just click on the little blue question mark next to the data entry field, you will get the definition as expressed exactly by the regulator as a quick reference. I still think you need to be across the regulators' documents on these, because to some extent, just looking at some of these metrics in isolation, you fail to see the full picture, and there's something to be said for understanding these metrics in the context of the overall architecture of what they've come up with, which is kind of, I've tried to do a kind of rough and ready trot around the architecture. So again, I would, it really is important that you, I really do feel for you as smaller organizations, the regulatory burden that you have to get your head around with. There's no escaping it if you want to. Right. Joe is saying, can you clarify the safety checks? Are we required to confirm that all safety checks due on that date have been completed? Joe, yeah, again, what you'll find in the regulators' definitions in that Annex 4, is very, very, very precise wording, actually for all of these, that refer to the appropriate statute and refer very specifically for those properties that you have identified that fall within the statute for each of these areas and for which a check is required. And it very much is about staying within those dates. I actually think, and I've only skimmed it recently, but again, I thought this was particularly for these health and safety metrics, I thought it was particularly comprehensive. Again, if there is something that where it is silent on a specific situation, you have definitely get in touch with the regulator about it. Right, I'm conscious of the time. Right, I think I'm going to kind of almost get there. So, as I say, the previous 4 slides were all about how where the TSMs sit with regards to existing metrics. Just to, if you like, tidy up Acuity's benchmarking system, but also to limit the burden falling on you, bearing in mind you have to collect all these new metrics now. On the back of consultation that we did at clubs in the autumn, we have killed off the RC series of repairs costs. Now they're the metrics that are driven by your management accounts, where you kind of take your overall spend on repairs and maintenance, and you divvy it across 7 different heads like cyclical, voids, response, other planned, etc. Yeah, so it divvies up your R&M spend. On the basis that we've got 2 really good cost metrics that span responsive repairs and voids, and also planned work in the shape of planned improvements and cyclical. There are those metrics that we collect as part of a suite of 4, and I covered them at the last workshop, are really, really solid cost metrics that we think probably serve you better than getting you to just break up your maintenance into further strands from your management accounts, because there is still wiggle room there that you might not be 100% comparing like with like. I think the RC series was served a purpose, was of its day, but since our more solid bench cost indicators have come in, that we crafted in conjunction with Housemarque, allows you to compare with the bigger associations. We think you're just better off with them. And it's just too much detail with all of this. And then there's some minor indicators that some of you collected that we just killed off because they just felt a bit naughties, actually. The one thing that survived, this is my pet hate, this indicator. I just think the right first time metric, it seems to be important to quite a lot of you. Well, not so much to you, but to your board members for some strange reason. My personal feeling is it's a corrupted indicator because people have fiddled with it. The sector's fiddled with it too much. It's drifted so far away from what was intended. And frankly, what was intended was to actually put a rocket up the jackses of councils around about 2005. I just think it's had its day, but that's just me. So timeline going forward, we have set all these TSMs up on your data collection sheets, as I mentioned. That happened some time ago. So those of you that want to road test these metrics, fill your boots over the next 6 weeks. We're doing a TSM day. In fact, that's now. I'm delivering that. So I've hit that one. So that's good. As I've said, those of you that want to pilot/baseline this, so and by baselining, before you do this for real next year, or so you've got some kind of comparison, you might want the comfort of a pre-regulatory baseline to start measuring your direction of travel again. That's all I mean by that. It's up to you. It's not obligatory this year at all. You might want to do it. And even if you do it and you don't publish your results, just by going through the process might help you fine-tune your data collection systems and iron out any definitional issues you have. Those of you that do pilot it, we will produce a pilot report to you along with your annual benchmarking report that you get every year, around about the same time in June, July. And then as from next year, this time next year, you'll be in it for real. You will be cobbling together your data from the first year of collecting these metrics for real. As I've already said, at some point, and if you like Anne and many others, you'll be sending your tenants an annual report or something around about September, October, November, which I think will meet the requirement of it being timely. So you'll be doing that every year, round about then. And of course, you'll be making it clear and easily accessible. And in fact, I think for the Corpi or for the Nat Fed or for the regulator, I wrote some guidance on how you should be reporting such data to tenants a million years ago when we last had a consumer regulator. I bet you it's not out of date if it's lurking on a website somewhere. And then later in autumn 2024, the regulator will be publishing its results for the bigger associations. Remember, you don't have to submit your results to the regulator, so they ain't going to have your results at all. But the bigger associations, they'll have them, and they're going to be creating their own benchmarking tool for tenants to have a play about with, compare their landlords, and hold them to account. Right, anything pops into your head, that's me. Contact me with it. I am happy to actually liaise with the regulator on some issues that I think are particularly general on your behalf, because I think it will be useful for us to get a declaration on it for the greater good. So do channel them towards me, and I'll get in touch with the regulator about it. We've got a really good relationship with the regulator, and of course it'll all be totally confidential. But I would say, you know, on virtually the regulator is completely approachable. The regulator is aware that these metrics and this approach hasn't been road tested. It will be very receptive to any questions you might want to put directly to the regulator. So let me just see if we've got any more questions. I don't think there are any more questions. As I say, if anything pops into your head, do get in touch with me. I hope this has been useful to you. As I say, there's only so far that we can go to actually cover all this material. So hopefully I pitched it at the right level without getting too involved in the definitions. But any issues arising, get in touch. Thanks for attending, and hope to see you in the future.